Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm Paul Warner of the Legislative Revenue Office, and I had the shortest distance of any panel to come across the hall. So thank you for inviting me. What I'd like to do is go through some of the fundamental forces we see that I think are really affecting our state economy. Not so much that there are things that you can resolve as a policymaker because they're global in nature, but you're dealing with the consequences, and I think they're very much things that are affecting our policy here in Oregon and really the lives of your constituents. So there are three things that I've identified here that are driving the U.S. and the world economy. The first is what I'm calling a balance sheet recession and recovery. This started in December of 2007. It was the longest recession we've had since 2933. Our recovery's been very weak. Historically, we've had weak recoveries following these balance sheet or financial sector-driven recessions, and now we appear to be very close to entering another recession as the economy has slowed. So we're in this period of adjusting to a number of fundamental imbalances that developed over the last 25 years, and I have a slide showing what those are. There's been a major geographic shift in the world economic order where what's driving the world economy. I think that has major implications for us in Oregon. And finally, there's a shift going on in what's driving U.S. economic growth, what there is of it, and what we expect to drive growth over the next 10 years or so, compared to what we've seen over the last 20 years. This slide I made up some time ago during the recession, but I still think it's the best way to capture the imbalances that grew over, you can see, essentially a 27-year period in which the amount of the economy that could be was committed to consumption, consumer spending, and housing jumped from 67 to 75% over that extended period. That's a huge jump in the amount of resources that are being driven by housing and consumption. So those are largely domestic sectors that were driving growth in the economy. And what was used to finance that shift was a sharp drop in household savings from around a historical average of 8 to 10% down to some quarters where we actually had negative savings leading up to the recession that started in December of 2007. And the corollary to that is that household debt was building up, and you can see basically a doubling of that household debt over that 27-year period as consumers were running up debt in order to finance housing and consumer spending. And also in that process, an imbalance developed in our foreign trade, which was essentially balanced in 1980. And by 2007, we had a huge, by any comparative standards, a huge net trade imbalance of 6% of GDP. So these are huge shifts that were going on within the economy, and they created these imbalances. Of course, the other side of this equation was, well, how was this being financed? It was being financed by borrowing from overseas. A lot of it from China, from Asia, and from those countries that were saving more than, that were consuming less than what they were producing. And they were, of course, also exporting into this market for American consumers. So those imbalances, what we're seeing right now is an adjustment to those imbalances. For example, the saving rate has risen into the 4 to 6% range. Household debt has dropped below 120%. And we've seen some gains on net exports. So those things are being corrected. The problem is it's a long, slow, painful process to go through, and we're pretty much in the middle of that process now. The other shift that's going on in terms of that, in terms of the world economy, and there was an article in The Economist last week, and I made a chart from that. I thought it was interesting because it gives you a very long-term look at where the center of economic power has been historically. Of course, going back to 1870, it was the European countries, with Britain as playing the dominant role. By the post-war period, 1973, the U.S. economy, you can see that the U.S. economy was more than constitutes a higher percentage of the world economy than the next two largest economies combined, much as Britain had done in 1870. By 2010, we're in a period now where there is a lot more balance between the top two countries, with Japan sliding due primarily to demographics. And by 2030, these projections that were in the article in The Economist have China at 18% of the world economy, and the U.S. down to about 10.1%. The share is measured here as a combination of share of world GDP primarily, but also trade and capital flows. So you can see where that shift is going. The other thing that's interesting about 2030 is notice that China would be at a dominant role, similar to what the U.S. was in 1973, and similar to what Great Britain was in 1870. Now, keep in mind, though, this doesn't mean that China is going to be richer than the U.S. This is just percentage of the world economy, and there's about 4 times as many Chinese as there are Americans. So on a per capita basis, we're not talking about China becoming better off than the U.S. We're just talking about their overall economy taking up a bigger share of the total. So as we look to the U.S. economy and these imbalances that have grown, look at what might be driving the U.S. economy as we look ahead for the next 10 years or so. Well, those of you who fondly recall the principles of macroeconomics and the kind of the ABCs of that, looking at the components of demand, consumption, housing I've broken out, business investment, government spending, and then a netting of exports and imports into the economy. Well, in fact, this quote came from Robert Solow, who's probably best known for his work on growth theory over the years. But looking at those components, Solow's conclusion is that consumer spending will not be as strong a driving force as it had been in the past. I think if my daughter was here, she'd probably say, well, duh. Because we're not going to be able to sustain the kind of consumer spending we've had over the last several decades because the debt simply won't be there to finance it. Government spending, and we've seen this kind of play out here over the last last couple of years, government spending is limited by the amount of debt financing that either the bond markets so far have not really punished the government for borrowing so much because interest rates are so low, yet we're seeing kind of the political response to that with a lot of pressure at the federal level.
Can you pause for just a second, Mr.
Yeah, go right ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not seeing the handout of this presentation. If it's been given to me, I'm just missing it. Could you go back 2 slides, maybe just one slide? I want to see the U.S. I was at 13.2, China 12.6. I'm trying to take notes. Thank you very much. In terms of current 13.3, 12.3, and Japan 6.9. Thank you.
Okay.
Paul, is there a way that we could have copies of your presentation when we're done?
Okay. Absolutely.
That would be great. Okay.
I'm sorry,
They were provided to you electronically, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Go ahead.
So what that leaves, and this is following up on the quote from Robert Solow, leaves the 2 sources of expenditure growth as net exports, which one of that component netting out exports and imports, and business investment. And in fact, there's this quote was from about early stages of the recovery. Very similar quote in the Wall Street Journal this week from Glenn Hubbard, basically arguing the same thing, that it's going to have to be exports and business investment that are going to drive economic growth in the U.S. in order to restore the imbalances that have happened. There's